In the winter of 1891, 24 experienced trappers entered a remote northern valley, and only 9 came back. They weren't unarmed. They weren't inexperienced. Yet 15 men vanished without a trace. The survivors spoke of towering shadows, heavy footsteps circling their camp at night, and a silence so deep it felt like the forest itself was watching them. The official report blamed cold and panic, but 18-inch footprints and crushed bodies tell a different story. Did they simply get lost in the wilderness? Or did they cross a boundary guarded by something ancient? It was the winter of 1891 when 24 experienced trappers disappeared into the northern wilderness, chasing a promise that many believed was too good to ignore. The newspapers at the time called it the richest fur season in decades. Beaver pelts were selling at record prices, and rumors spread through frontier towns about a remote valley untouched by hunters, where animals moved in such numbers that the riverbanks seemed alive. Men who had survived blizzards, wolves, starvation, and even small border skirmishes packed their rifles and steel traps without hesitation. They believed they understood the forest. They believed they understood fear. They were wrong. The group formed in a trading post town near the edge of the territory. Most of them had worked alone before, but the valley was said to be deep beyond mapped land, past frozen rivers and jagged ridgelines. Traveling together meant protection. Their leader, Thomas Hale, was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with 15 winters of trapping behind him. He had lost 2 fingers to frostbite years earlier and carried the kind of quiet authority that discouraged argument. With him were brothers Edwin and Samuel Pike, both in their 20s and eager to prove themselves, Marcus Reed, who had once served as a scout for the army, and nearly 20 others, each hardened by the frontier. They entered the forest in late November. Snow had already begun to settle across the ground in a thin, deceptive layer that hid roots and stone. The first 3 days were uneventful. They followed a narrow animal trail along a half-frozen river, marking trees with shallow hatchet cuts to ensure they could retrace their path. At night, they built large fires, posted watches, and shared coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. Laughter carried through the trees. They spoke of profits, of new homes, of wives waiting in warm kitchens. On the 4th night, something changed. It began with the dogs. The group had brought 6 sled dogs to help haul supplies. Around midnight, all 6 began growling in low, continuous tones. Not barking, not howling, just growling, their ears pinned back, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The man on watch, a trapper named Lionel Graves, later claimed he heard footsteps in the snow circling the camp. Slow, heavy, measured. He assumed it was a moose or perhaps a bear disturbed from early hibernation. He added more wood to the fire and waited. In the morning, they found tracks. They were larger than wolf tracks, but not shaped like any bear's paw. The impressions were elongated, almost like a human footprint, but far too big. Nearly 18 inches long. The stride between them suggested something tall, taller than any man present. Some of the trappers laughed it off. Marcus Reed suggested it could be overlapping tracks distorted by melting snow. Thomas Hale said nothing, but he ordered the men to keep closer together as they traveled. By the 7th day, they reached the valley. It was real. The rumors had not exaggerated. The valley opened wide between 2 ridgelines, with a winding river cutting through its center. Animal tracks crisscrossed the snow in every direction. Beaver lodges dotted the riverbanks. Elk grazed in the distance. It was, by all visible measures, a fortune waiting to be claimed. They set up a semi-permanent camp near a cluster of pine trees, building crude log shelters reinforced with canvas. Over the next 3 days, they spread outward in pairs to set traps and mark locations. Spirits lifted again. Even Thomas Hale allowed himself a rare smile. They would return wealthy. The first disappearance happened on the 10th day. On the 4th night, something changed. It began with the dogs. The group had brought 6 sled dogs to help haul supplies. Around midnight, all 6 began growling in low, continuous tones. Not barking, not howling, just growling, their ears pinned back, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The man on watch, a trapper named Lionel Graves, later claimed he heard footsteps in the snow circling the camp. Slow, heavy, measured. He assumed it was a moose or perhaps a bear disturbed from early hibernation. He added more wood to the fire and waited. In the morning, they found tracks. They were larger than wolf tracks, but not shaped like any bear's paw. The impressions were elongated, almost like a human footprint, but far too big. nearly 18 inches long. The stride between them suggested something tall, taller than any man present. Some of the trappers laughed it off. Marcus Reed suggested it could be overlapping tracks distorted by melting snow. Thomas Hale said nothing, but he ordered the men to keep closer together as they traveled. By the 7th day, they reached the valley. It was real. The rumors had not exaggerated. The valley opened wide between two ridgelines, with a winding river cutting through its center. Animal tracks crisscrossed the snow in every direction. Beaver lodges dotted the riverbanks. Elk grazed in the distance. It was, by all visible measures, a fortune waiting to be claimed. They set up a semi-permanent camp near a cluster of pine trees, building crude log shelters reinforced with canvas. Over the next 3 days, they spread outward in pairs to set traps and mark locations. Spirits lifted again. Even Thomas Hale allowed himself a rare smile. They would return wealthy. The first disappearance happened on the 10th day. Edwin Pike had gone out before dawn to check a line of traps less than a mile from camp. When he did not return by mid-afternoon, his brother Samuel organized a search party. They followed Edwin's tracks easily. The snow had not yet fallen again. The trail led straight toward the river. Halfway there, his footprints simply stopped. There was no sign of struggle. No blood. No broken branches. Just a final clear impression of his boot in the snow, and then nothing. The snow beyond was untouched, smooth, unmarked, as if he had stepped into air. Panic began to seep into the camp like cold through thin fabric. Some argued that he must have fallen through ice and been carried under the river's current. But the ice near the riverbank was thick and unbroken. Others suggested he wandered off disoriented. Yet how could a man vanish without leaving tracks? That night, no one laughed around the fire. 2 days later, another man disappeared. Then another. This time, there were signs. A rifle found snapped in half. A line of traps crushed and twisted as if stepped on by something immensely heavy. One trapper, Jonas Whitfield, was discovered dead nearly 2 miles from camp. His body lay face down in the snow, eyes open, expression frozen in terror. There were no bite marks, no bullet wounds, but his ribs were crushed inward, as though he had been gripped by enormous force. The men began to argue openly. Some wanted to abandon the valley immediately. Others insisted that fear was clouding their judgment. Men don't just vanish, Marcus Reed said, though his voice no longer carried conviction. Thomas Hale finally agreed to break camp at first light. They never made it to morning. Just after midnight, the forest erupted with sound. Not wolves. Not wind. It was a deep, resonating roar that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The dogs snapped their tethers and fled into the darkness. Something massive moved between the trees, visible only as a shifting silhouette blocking. Starlight. Gunshots rang out, flashes lighting up panicked faces. Samuel Pike later claimed he saw it clearly for a second. He described a towering figure covered in dark matted hair, its shoulders broad as a doorway. Its eyes reflected the firelight, not like an animal's yellow gleam, but a pale, almost white shimmer. It moved with terrifying speed for something so large. Chaos consumed the camp. Men ran blindly into the woods. Others fired until their rifles clicked empty. Screams echoed and were abruptly cut short. Thomas Hale tried to rally them, shouting for formation, for discipline, but his voice was swallowed by the roar. By dawn, the valley was silent again. 9 men stumbled out of the forest 3 weeks later, half-starved and frostbitten, reaching a logging settlement miles south. They were barely recognizable. Beards thick with ice, eyes hollow, hands shaking uncontrollably. Of the original 24, only those 9 returned. When questioned, their stories did not align perfectly, but certain details remained consistent. They spoke of being stalked for days as they fled, of hearing heavy footsteps paralleling them just beyond sight, of finding trees uprooted and thrown across their path as if to herd them. One man swore he saw 2 shapes on a ridgeline at dusk, watching. Most disturbing was their shared refusal to give a complete account of that final night. Whenever pressed, they fell silent. Samuel Pike, who had lost his brother, reportedly said only this before refusing further interviews. It wasn't an animal. And it wasn't alone. The official explanation filed months later blamed exposure, hysteria, and internal conflict among the men. The crushed ribs of Jonas Whitfield were attributed to a possible rock slide. The strange tracks were dismissed as natural distortion. The case was closed without further investigation. But trappers avoided that valley for decades afterward. In the years that followed, scattered reports surfaced from hunters and prospectors traveling near the same region. Stories of massive footprints found after fresh snowfall, of distant roars rolling through the trees at night, of supplies vanishing from camps without a trace. None stayed long enough to confirm anything. Today, the valley remains largely untouched. Satellite images show dense forest canopy and winding water, but no roads, no settlements. Local folklore warns travelers not to camp there after dark. Whether the truth lies in an undiscovered species, a violent clash lost to pride and panic, or something still watching from a tree line, no one can say for certain. What is known is simple and documented. 24 men entered that wilderness in the winter of 1891. Only 9 walked out. And even on their deathbeds years later, none of them ever fully explained what waited in the valley beyond the ridgeline. 4 years after the 9 men returned, the official version remained simple: exposure, hysteria, internal violence. It was easier for townsfolk to accept that greed and fear had destroyed the expedition than to imagine something ancient had risen from the trees. The frontier had enough dangers already. No one wanted to add another. But the story did not end when the survivors reached civilization. Samuel Pike never fully recovered from losing his brother Edwin. In the months that followed, he rarely slept indoors. He claimed walls made him feel trapped. Twice he was found outside town in the middle of the night, staring into the tree line as if expecting something to step out of it. When asked what he was looking for, he once replied, making sure it didn't follow. Marcus Reed tried to speak rationally about what happened. He gave structured interviews, describing timelines, weather patterns, distances traveled. Yet even he avoided certain details. When questioned about the night of the attack, he would pause for long stretches, jaw tightening, eyes unfocused. It was coordinated, he admitted once. It wasn't rage. It was hunting. The hunting did not begin with the attack. It began days earlier. On the 13th day in the valley, after Edwin Pike vanished, Thomas Hale had ordered tighter formations. No one was to walk alone. Yet signs suggested something was testing them. Traps were sprung without animals inside. Supplies were shifted slightly during the night. Not stolen, just moved. A sack of flour turned over. A rifle relocated from one tree to another. Subtle things. Psychological things. Lionel Graves was the first to suggest they were being studied. Predators test herds, he said quietly near the fire. They separate the weak. Jonas Whitfield laughed at the idea. We are not deer. But 3 days later, Jonas was dead with his ribs crushed inward. After the initial attack that left 13 gone, the remaining 9 fled north rather than south, a mistake Marcus Reed later admitted likely cost more lives. They were disoriented, running in darkness, guided only by slope and instinct. The forest thickened as they moved, trees growing closer together, branches clawing at their coats. They heard them for 3 nights straight. Not constant pursuit. That would have been merciful. Instead, the sounds came in intervals. A heavy step far behind. A tree snapping somewhere to the left. Once, unmistakable breathing just beyond sight. Slow, deep, controlled. On the 4th night of escape, Thomas Hale made a decision that would fracture the group permanently. They were down to minimal ammunition. Food had run out. 2 men could barely walk due to frostbite. Hale insisted they abandon excess gear to move faster. Marcus Reed disagreed. If we drop rifles, we are dead. We are dead if we can't move, Hale snapped. The argument escalated. Accusations surfaced. Who fired recklessly during the attack? Who ran first? Who left someone behind? Fear rotted discipline from the inside. The creatures, if creatures they were, did not need to attack. The men were unraveling themselves. That same night, Elias Moore disappeared while on watch. There was no scream. Only his empty bedroll and a set of enormous tracks pressed into fresh snow leading away from camp. The survivors no longer spoke of going home rich. They spoke only of survival. 2 days later, they found evidence that chilled them more deeply than any wind. At the edge of a clearing, propped upright against a broken pine, stood Marcus Doyle's body. He had vanished during the initial chaos in the basin. Now he was positioned deliberately, arms hanging limp, head tilted slightly forward. No visible wounds. Eyes open. It was a message. Samuel Pike vomited in the snow. Thomas Hale ordered the body left untouched. "It wants us to react," he said, though his voice trembled. "It wants fear." They were correct. That night, the forest remained silent. No footsteps. No roars. The silence pressed against their ears until some swore they heard whispering within it. By morning, one of the frostbitten men had died quietly in his sleep. 6 remained. When they finally reached the logging settlement weeks later, they weighed nearly 30 pounds less each. Frostbite had taken 2 toes from Lionel Graves. Samuel Pike's hair had begun turning prematurely white. The settlement doctor documented physical trauma, malnutrition, and severe psychological distress. But what lingered most was their shared hyper-awareness of tree lines. All 9 men, even indoors, positioned themselves where they could see exits. Over time, pieces of their testimonies were recorded in journals and private letters. One entry from Marcus Reed, written months later, reads, "It mimicked us. Once, while we argued, I heard something in the dark copy the rhythm of Thomas's cough. Not perfectly, but close enough." Another account describes finding stacked stones deep in the valley days before the first disappearance. Not natural formations. Balanced intentionally. Years passed. Most of the 9 avoided each other. Shared trauma bonded them, but it also reminded them. 3 died within a decade. 2 from illness, 1 from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Samuel Pike lived the longest. On his deathbed in 1924, a local priest reportedly asked him whether he believed what they saw was animal or demon. Samuel's answer was recorded by the priest's son decades later. "Neither," he whispered. "It was older, and it knew we didn't belong." In the 1930s, a small survey team attempted to map the region properly. Their report mentioned unusual acoustic phenomena, low-frequency vibrations at night that carried for miles. They also noted large, unidentified tracks after fresh snowfall. The expedition cut its survey short due to equipment failure and unease among personnel. Hunters still avoid the basin. Modern satellite imagery shows dense canopy and no permanent settlement. In 1978, a pair of wildlife researchers recorded a series of inhuman vocalizations in roughly the same coordinates described in Hale's original route. Audio analysis concluded the sounds did not match known animal databases at the time. Skeptics argue mass hysteria explains everything. Starvation, isolation, and fear can distort perception. Men under extreme stress misinterpret shadows. They turn on one another. They create monsters to justify tragedy. But skeptics struggle to explain the tracks. In 2006, a hiker posted photographs online of a footprint found in that region. 18 inches long, 5 clear toe impressions, stride length exceeding 5 feet. The post was deleted within days. The hiker refused interviews. The supply ledger from 1891 still exists in a regional archive. 24 signatures before departure. 9 marked returned. No official cause of death for the other 15. And if you travel far enough north, beyond marked trails and maintained roads, locals will still warn you, don't camp in low basins where the forest grows too quiet. Because sometimes, the most dangerous predator isn't the one that charges. It's the one that watches. The winter of 1891 was supposed to be remembered for profit, not for silence. Yet in the decades that followed, the silence surrounding the basin grew heavier than the snow that buried it each year. Officially, the case of Thomas Hale's expedition was filed away under frontier misadventure. Unofficially, it became something else, a story told carefully, often after dark, and never near open forest. What the public never saw were the supplementary notes attached to the settlement doctor's report. Those pages were not printed in newspapers. They were sealed in a county archive box labeled Unverified Observations. In those notes, the doctor described something peculiar about the survivors' injuries. Yes, there was frostbite. Yes, malnutrition. But several of the 9 men had bruising patterns inconsistent with simple falls or animal mauling. The marks were elongated, almost finger-like, spaced wider than any human hand could span. Not claw marks. Not bite impressions. Pressure bruises. As though something had gripped them. Marcus Reed returned once, only once, to the outer edge of the territory the following summer. Not to the basin itself, but close enough to stand within a day's walk of it. He told no one his intention beforehand. When he came back, he carried no fur, no game, no trophies. Only a small leather notebook. That notebook disappeared after his death in 1902. However, Fragments of its contents were quoted in a letter written by his cousin, preserved in a private family collection. In it, Marcus described hiking to a ridge overlooking the valley. He wrote that from that distance, everything looked peaceful. Birds circled overhead. Wind moved through trees normally. But he also wrote this: the silence returns in waves. It's not constant. It comes like breath. When it comes, even insects stop. He claimed he found old remains of their camp, rotting canvas, rusted trap fragments. But something else disturbed him more: trees arranged unnaturally in a rough semicircle around where their fire pit once stood. Not fallen randomly. Leaned inward. Watching. Marcus never went back again. By the early 1900s, railroads expanded deeper into frontier territory. Logging operations increased. Yet curiously, no company established permanent work in that specific basin. Internal memos from one lumber corporation in 1911 mention abandoning a survey due to repeated nighttime disturbances and unsettling auditory phenomena. No further detail was provided. Then came the incident of 1934. 3 prospectors entered the region during late autumn, reportedly searching for silver deposits rumored beneath the ridgeline north of the basin. Only one returned. His name was Daniel Crow. Unlike the 9 trappers decades earlier, Crow spoke publicly, at least at first. He claimed his companions were taken at night by giants. Newspapers mocked him. Officials blamed alcohol. But one detail in his testimony mirrored the 1891 accounts almost exactly. He described the sensation of being funneled. "They didn't rush us," Crow said in a recorded interview. "They moved around us, cut off directions, pushed us where they wanted." Crow later recanted his story, stating grief had confused his memory. He moved away shortly after. In 1978, when wildlife researchers recorded those unexplained vocalizations in the region, the audio tapes were sent to multiple universities. Analysis revealed frequencies overlapping with known primate communication patterns, yet extending below typical human vocal range. The official conclusion labeled it inconclusive environmental noise. Unofficially, one acoustic specialist noted that the sounds appeared structured, layered, almost conversational. The psychological angle remains the strongest argument against anything extraordinary. Isolation does things to the human brain. Studies of Arctic explorers and deep wilderness expeditions confirm that paranoia, auditory hallucinations, and group breakdowns can occur under prolonged stress. The trappers were exhausted, starving, terrified. It is entirely plausible they misinterpreted natural predators as something mythic. But psychological collapse does not explain coordinated drag marks without blood. It does not explain bodies positioned deliberately. It does not explain identical track measurements reported decades apart. Modern satellite imaging shows tree growth patterns in the basin slightly irregular compared to surrounding forest. Some researchers speculate soil mineral differences. Others suggest microclimate effects. A small independent team that attempted a drone survey in 2012 reported repeated signal interference above the valley center. Equipment malfunction was blamed. There is one final detail rarely mentioned in summaries of the 1891 expedition. Thomas Hale kept meticulous records. Weather, rations, distances traveled. His logbook was recovered with the 9 survivors. Most pages detailed ordinary trapping activities. But the final entry, written the afternoon before the midnight attack, was different. The handwriting changed. Less steady. It read, "We are not alone in this valley. It understands distance. It tests boundary. Tonight the forest feels closer." No further entries followed. Some cryptozoologists argue that if a relic hominid species existed, highly territorial, highly intelligent, avoiding human contact, a remote basin with natural ridgelines forming a barrier would be ideal habitat. Such a species would not need to number in thousands. A small, tightly controlled population could persist undetected for generations, especially if actively discouraging human presence. Skeptics counter that no physical remains have ever been verified. No bones. No DNA. No clear photographic evidence. Yet absence of evidence in dense wilderness is not evidence of absence. Forests consume quickly. Snow conceals thoroughly. The most unsettling possibility is not that something monstrous attacked those men. It is that something organized did. Predators kill for food. These encounters suggest something else: territorial enforcement, strategic intimidation. Removal of intrusion. The 9 survivors described feeling watched long before the violence began. Supplies moved subtly. Perimeters tested. Noise patterns probing response times. That is not random aggression. That is assessment. In recent years, hikers passing miles south of the basin have reported an unusual phenomenon: sudden overwhelming dread without visible cause. The sensation of being observed from elevated ground. Compasses briefly spinning before stabilizing. These reports are anecdotal and widely dismissed. Still, the region remains largely undeveloped. And perhaps that is the quiet agreement humanity has made without realizing it. Some places are left alone not because we fully understand the danger, but because something in us recognizes when we are not the dominant presence. 24 men entered that valley seeking profit. 9 returned carrying something far heavier than loss. They carried certainty. Not belief. Not theory. Certainty that in the deepest quiet of untouched forest, there are intelligences that do not announce themselves. They wait. They measure. And when necessary, they remove. If you ever find yourself in a forest where the animals stop making noise all at once, where the wind seems to hold its breath, where the tree line feels less like scenery and more like an audience, leave. Because the men of 1891 learned too late that the most dangerous wilderness is not the one that howls. It is the one that watches back. For nearly a century, the basin remained an unspoken boundary on unofficial maps. Hunters skirted around it. Surveyors shortened routes to avoid cutting through it. Even those who dismissed the old stories tended to laugh about them from a comfortable distance, never from within the tree line itself. In 1996, a graduate anthropology student named Claire Bennett began researching frontier disappearances for her thesis. She came across the 1891 ledger by accident while cataloging regional trade records. 24 signatures. 9 marked returned. 15 left blank with no formal closure. She noticed something historians had overlooked. Each of the 9 survivors died within a relatively narrow geographic radius of one another, never moving far from the territory. None relocated east despite railway expansion offering opportunity. None settled in densely populated cities. It was as though they feared distance from wilderness, but also feared going too deep into it again. Claire tracked down private family letters from descendants of Lionel Graves. One passage, written in 1908, described Lionel waking in the middle of the night repeatedly to check that doors were barred. He kept heavy furniture positioned in front of windows despite living on the second floor. When asked why, he reportedly told his wife, "Height doesn't matter." Claire found that phrase chilling. In 2001, she organized a small, carefully funded field research trip, not directly into the basin, but to its perimeter. The goal was modest: document environmental anomalies, verify old trail routes, and collect soil samples. Her team included a wildlife biologist, an acoustic technician, and 2 experienced backcountry guides. The first 2 days were uneventful. Wildlife appeared normal. No unusual prints. Standard forest behavior. On the 3rd night, the acoustic technician's equipment recorded low-frequency vibrations between 18 and 22 Hz, barely audible but physically perceptible as subtle pressure. The sensation caused mild nausea in 2 team members. The sound did not resemble wind. It pulsed at irregular intervals, sometimes stretching for nearly a minute. At 2:13 a.m., all forest noise ceased. No insects. No distant animal movement. Nothing. The silence lasted 4 minutes. When natural sounds resumed, they did so gradually, as though layered back in. The following morning, Claire discovered something near the tree line roughly 300 yards from camp. 3 stones stacked vertically on a flat rock, balanced with precision. Neither guide admitted building it. The formation was not present the previous day. They left the area that afternoon. Back at her university lab, analysis of soil samples revealed elevated mineral content consistent with glacial movement. Nothing extraordinary. Audio files, however, drew attention. One sound engineer noted faint harmonic layering within the low-frequency pulses, almost like overlapping tones. Structured. Claire never returned to the basin. In interviews years later, she maintained that while no definitive proof of unknown species was found, the behavioral pattern described in 1891 aligned disturbingly well with territorial primate defense strategies observed in guerrilla troops, minus the scale. If something lived there, it did not behave like an animal defending food. It behaved like something defending boundary. In 2012, 2 experienced ultralight backpackers documented an attempted traverse through the northern ridge bordering the basin. Their GPS logs show steady movement for 2 days. On the 3rd day, tracking data becomes erratic. Circular paths. Sudden direction changes. Repeated backtracking without logical explanation. When interviewed later, one hiker described an overwhelming sensation of being subtly redirected. "It's hard to explain," he said. "Every time we tried to push deeper, something would happen. A fallen tree blocking us that wasn't there on the map, a sudden rock slide, equipment slipping at the worst moment. Nothing dramatic. Just constant interference." They never reached the valley floor. The idea of coordinated interference may sound extreme, yet territorial animals often manipulate environment to their advantage. Beavers alter waterways. Certain primates throw objects to intimidate. Ravens have been documented solving complex spatial problems. Scale that intelligence upward. Increase physical capability. Add generations of adaptation to a specific isolated geography. You get something efficient. What continues to disturb researchers is not aggression, but restraint. In 1891, after the initial violent confrontation, the remaining men were not chased down immediately. They were pressured, funneled, monitored. The pattern suggests calculated removal rather than chaotic slaughter. If eradication were the goal, none would have returned. 9 did. Why? One theory proposes that allowing survivors serves a purpose. Survivors carry stories. Stories discourage return. Territory remains protected without continuous conflict. In that sense, the basin has been defended successfully for over a century. There is one more piece rarely discussed. In 1924, shortly after Samuel Pike's death, a local undertaker recorded something odd while preparing the body. Deep scar tissue across Samuel's upper back, not from claws, not from blade, but from pressure trauma, as if something had gripped and lifted him years earlier. Samuel had never mentioned being physically seized. He carried that detail to the grave. If he had been taken briefly and released during the chaos of 1891, it raises uncomfortable possibilities. Why spare him? Why allow him to live with certainty? Perhaps because witnesses amplify fear more effectively than total disappearance. Today, the basin remains unnamed on most recreational maps. Coordinates exist, of course. Satellites see canopy. But human presence there remains minimal. The forest has regrown over old campsites. Snow continues to fall each winter, covering whatever impressions might still form. No verified body from the original 15 has ever been recovered. No confirmed biological sample has been authenticated. Yet patterns repeat. Silence in waves. Low-frequency resonance. Stacked stones. Funneling behavior. And always, the sensation reported across generations. Being watched by something patient. If the creatures, or whatever intelligence occupies that basin, still exist, they have demonstrated one consistent trait for over a century. They do not expand outward. They do not seek conflict beyond boundary. They simply enforce. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this. The frontier was never truly empty. It only appeared that way because what lived there chose not to be seen. Until 24 men walked into the wrong valley in the winter of 1891 and forced something ancient to remind them whose land it was. Some mysteries fade with time. Others remain quiet on purpose. And somewhere beyond map trails, in a basin where the forest sometimes forgets to breathe, the watchers may still be standing just beyond the reach of firelight, waiting to see who steps too far next. For nearly a century, the basin remained an unspoken boundary on unofficial maps. Hunters skirted around it. Surveyors shortened routes to avoid cutting through it. Even those who dismissed the old stories tended to laugh about them from a comfortable distance, never from within the tree line itself. In 1996, a graduate anthropology student named Claire Bennett began researching frontier disappearances for her thesis. She came across the 1891 ledger by accident while cataloguing regional trade records. 24 signatures. 9 marked returned. 15 left blank with no formal closure. She noticed something historians had overlooked. Each of the 9 survivors died within a relatively narrow geographic radius of one another, never moving far from the territory. None relocated east despite railway expansion offering opportunity. None settled in densely populated cities. It was as though they feared distance from wilderness, but also feared going too deep into it again. Claire tracked down private family letters from descendants of Lionel Graves. One passage, written in 1908, described Lionel waking in the middle of the night repeatedly to check that doors were barred. He kept heavy furniture positioned in front of windows despite living on the second floor. When asked why, he reportedly told his wife, "Height doesn't matter." Claire found that phrase chilling. In 2001, she organized a small, carefully funded field research trip, not directly into the basin, but to its perimeter. The goal was modest: document environmental anomalies, verify old trail routes, and collect soil samples. Her team included a wildlife biologist, an acoustic technician, and 2 experienced backcountry guides. The first 2 days were uneventful. Wildlife appeared normal. No unusual prints. Standard forest behavior. On the 3rd night, the acoustic technician's equipment recorded low-frequency vibrations between 18 and 22 Hz, barely audible but physically perceptible as subtle pressure. The sensation caused mild nausea in 2 team members. The sound did not resemble wind. It pulsed at irregular intervals, sometimes stretching for nearly a minute. At 2:13 a.m., all forest noise ceased. No insects. No distant animal movement. Nothing. The silence lasted 4 minutes. When natural sounds resumed, they did so gradually, as though layered back in. The following morning, Claire discovered something near the tree line roughly 300 yards from camp. 3 stones stacked vertically on a flat rock, balanced with precision. Neither guide admitted building it. The formation was not present the previous day. They left the area that afternoon. Back at her university lab, analysis of soil samples revealed elevated mineral content consistent with glacial movement. Nothing extraordinary. Audio files, however, drew attention. One sound engineer noted faint harmonic layering within the low-frequency pulses, almost like overlapping tones. Structured. Claire never returned to the basin. In interviews years later, she maintained that while no definitive proof of unknown species was found, the behavioral pattern described in 1891 aligned disturbingly well with territorial primate defense strategies observed in guerrilla troops, minus the scale. If something lived there, it did not behave like an animal defending food. It behaved like something defending boundary. In 2012, 2 experienced ultralight backpackers documented an attempted traverse through the northern ridge bordering the basin. Their GPS logs show steady movement for 2 days. On the 3rd day, tracking data becomes erratic. Circular paths. Sudden direction changes. Repeated backtracking without logical explanation. When interviewed later, one hiker described an overwhelming sensation of being subtly redirected. "It's hard to explain," he said. "Every time we tried to push deeper, something would happen. A fallen tree blocking us that wasn't there on the map, a sudden rock slide, equipment slipping at the worst moment. Nothing dramatic. Just constant interference." They never reached the valley floor. The idea of coordinated interference may sound extreme, yet territorial animals often manipulate environment to their advantage. Beavers alter waterways. Certain primates throw objects to intimidate. Ravens have been documented solving complex spatial problems. Scale that intelligence upward. Increase physical capability. Add generations of adaptation to a specific isolated geography. You get something efficient. What continues to disturb researchers is not aggression, but restraint. In 1891, after the initial violent confrontation, the remaining men were not chased down immediately. They were pressured, funneled, monitored. The pattern suggests calculated removal rather than chaotic slaughter. If eradication were the goal, none would have returned. 9 did. Why? One theory proposes that allowing survivors serves a purpose. Survivors carry stories. Stories discourage return. Territory remains protected without continuous conflict. In that sense, the basin has been defended successfully for over a century. There is one more piece rarely discussed. In 1924, shortly after Samuel Pike's death, a local undertaker recorded something odd while preparing the body. Deep scar tissue across Samuel's upper back, not from claws, not from blade, but from pressure trauma. As if something had gripped and lifted him years earlier. Samuel had never mentioned being physically seized. He carried that detail to the grave. If he had been taken briefly and released during the chaos of 1891, it raises uncomfortable possibilities. In 2021, a wildfire burned within 40 miles of the basin's southern perimeter. It did not reach the valley itself, but smoke drifted across the ridgelines for days. Satellite heat signatures briefly pierced areas that had remained visually impenetrable for decades. For a short window, thermal imaging revealed unusual cold pockets within the densest section of the basin, zones that retained lower temperatures despite surrounding heat. Climatologists attributed it to water density and shade concentration. But one independent analyst reviewing publicly available satellite overlays noted something peculiar. The cold pockets were not random. They formed loose arcs, almost like perimeter lines. Around the same time, a former park ranger named Daniel Mercer came forward with a story he had kept private for nearly 30 years. In 1992, while stationed at a remote lookout tower northeast of the basin, he began noticing a pattern during certain nights of the year, usually late winter, when snowpack was thickest. Shortly after midnight, the forest would go silent in a radius he estimated to be nearly a mile wide. Then, faint but distinct, he would hear what he described as wood knocks. 2 sharp impacts. Pause. Then 3 in response, farther away. At first, he assumed it was falling branches or distant logging. But the pattern repeated too consistently. 2 knocks. Response of 3. Then silence. He never reported it formally. "You don't build a career on sounds in the dark," he later said. In 2023, a group of experienced wilderness filmmakers attempted to document unexplained phenomena in North American forests. They avoided the basin itself but camped within 10 miles of its southern boundary. Their footage, released in a limited online series, captured something subtle yet unsettling. During a nighttime segment, while one of the hosts described historical disappearances in the region, the infrared camera picked up 2 reflective points at tree-line height. Not ground level like a deer. Higher. The spacing between them was wider than a human face. The reflection lasted 3 seconds. When the host turned fully toward it, the points vanished. Viewers debated whether it was camera artifact, an owl, or deliberate hoax. The crew insisted it was none of those. They broke camp the next morning. Despite increasing technology, drones, thermal optics, satellite imaging, no one has successfully documented prolonged exploration of the basin center. Equipment failures are often cited. Battery drain in cold climates is common. GPS interference can happen in dense canopy. All explanations remain individually reasonable. But collectively, the pattern grows heavier. If an unknown species exists there, it has demonstrated remarkable restraint and strategy. It does not leave clear remains. It does not allow prolonged observation. It corrects intrusion early, subtly at first, violently if necessary. Some researchers now consider an alternative hypothesis. What if the basin is not simply habitat, but convergence? Low-frequency resonance recorded in 1978 and again in 2001 falls within ranges known to affect human anxiety levels. Infrasound between 18 to 20 Hz has been shown in laboratory settings to induce unease, dread, and even visual distortion in some subjects. Natural geological formations, caves, specific wind tunnels, subterranean cavities, can produce such frequencies under certain conditions. What if the basin's geography amplifies this naturally? And what if something living there has learned to use it? A creature that understands terrain acoustics could weaponize fear without direct confrontation. Silence waves. Resonant pulses. Strategic tree falls to redirect movement. Stone markers to test reaction. The trappers of 1891 may have been exposed to environmental pressure long before the first man vanished. Psychological destabilization does not require supernatural explanation, only sustained stress layered with targeted stimuli. Yet that still leaves the physical encounters. The crushed ribs. The lifted bodies. The enormous tracks measured consistently across decades. In 1891, Thomas Hale wrote that the forest felt closer. That phrase resurfaces in multiple modern accounts from the region. Hikers describe trees appearing compressed, as though depth perception shifts subtly. Trails that feel narrower than they are. A sensation of spatial distortion. Neurologists might attribute that to anxiety-altering perception. But anxiety typically follows stimulus. Here, the stimulus often remains unseen. In late 2024, an anonymous post surfaced on an outdoor survival forum. The user claimed to have ventured into the Outer Basin region alone during early snowfall. He described discovering a partially buried rusted steel trap embedded deep in a tree trunk nearly 10 feet above ground. The trap model matched designs commonly used in the late 1800s. If true, that would mean something, or someone, had placed it there long after 1891. The post was deleted within 48 hours. Skeptics argue that internet folklore perpetuates itself, that once a region gains reputation, every broken branch becomes evidence. Every shadow grows teeth. And they may be right. But even stripped of legend, the core remains documented. 24 experienced men entered the basin in the winter of 1891. 15 never returned. 9 came back changed, carrying consistent descriptions of towering figures, coordinated pursuit, and deliberate intimidation. Subsequent decades produced repeated, though fragmented, reports of similar patterns, acoustic anomalies, environmental manipulation, large bipedal tracks, and overwhelming sensations of being observed. No definitive proof has surfaced. No official acknowledgement has been made. The basin remains uninhabited. Perhaps the truth is not that something monstrous lives there. Perhaps the truth is simpler and more unsettling. Perhaps there exists a form of intelligence in that forest that does not need recognition, does not seek expansion, does not crave dominance beyond its boundary. It simply exists. Quietly. Patiently. And when the boundary is crossed too deeply, it responds, not with chaos, but with correction. The trappers of 1891 may have been the first large-scale intrusion into its core territory. They were not erased entirely. They were reduced. Enough survivors were allowed to leave so that the story would travel farther than any physical pursuit ever could. A warning embedded in memory instead of stone. And over a century later, the warning still works. Because despite advanced mapping, modern gear, and scientific curiosity, no one has successfully established permanent presence in that valley. Not because it is impossible, but because something, whether instinct, pattern recognition, or inherited caution, keeps humans turning back before they reach the center. Some places on Earth remain wild, not untouched, not undiscovered, but actively unclaimed. If you study enough wilderness survival accounts, you begin to notice something consistent. Predators that roar often fail. Predators that remain unseen succeed. The basin has remained unseen. And perhaps that is exactly the point. If you ever find yourself studying a map of remote northern forest and you notice a wide valley with no marked campsites, no hunting trails, no logging scars, no research stations, just an absence where activity should be, you might be looking at the same basin those 24 men walked into in 1891. And somewhere beyond the ridgeline, just outside the reach of your vision, something may still be measuring the distance between you and the center. By the time the story reached its 100th year, it had already split into 2 versions. One version lived in official archives, brittle paper, tidy summaries, rational conclusions. A failed expedition. Environmental hardship. Panic. Death by wilderness. The other version lived in pauses between sentences, in the way older locals glanced toward the northern tree line before changing the subject, in the fact that no outfitter offered guided hunts anywhere near the basin, despite the region being rich with game. History survives in documents. Warnings survive in behavior. In 2031, a privately funded geospatial research firm quietly attempted what no one had managed before, a fully autonomous drone grid sweep directly over the basin's center during midwinter, when leaf cover was minimal and snow contrast high. The operation required no boots on the ground. No visible human presence. Just machines. The first 2 drones transmitted normally. The third lost signal 47 seconds after crossing the inner ridgeline. The fourth captured something unusual before disconnecting. A brief thermal signature moving beneath canopy shadow. It was upright. Tall. The heat pattern did not match known wildlife profiles in the software database. The footage lasted 3 seconds. Publicly, the company cited magnetic interference and closed the project. Privately, one technician resigned. He later described the thermal anomaly in an anonymous interview. It wasn't the size alone. It was the movement. It wasn't wandering. It was pacing along the tree line. Like it knew exactly where the boundary was. Boundaries. That word appears again and again across 140 years of accounts. The 1891 trappers crossed one. The prospectors in 1934 crossed one. The researchers in 2001 approached one and turned back. Every time the pattern remains consistent. Subtle signals first. Environmental pressure. Psychological unease. Then, if ignored, escalation. What makes the original expedition so significant is not just the loss of 15 men. It is that the response was disproportionate to the intrusion. 24 armed adults entered the valley expecting dominance. Steel traps. Rifles. Fire. Whatever met them did not charge blindly. It studied. It tested reaction times by moving supplies. It separated individuals. It induced stress before direct confrontation. That is not random animal behavior. That is strategy. In evolutionary terms, strategy implies survival pressure over generations. Learned behavior. Possibly even communication systems refined over time. Which raises the final, unsettling question. If something intelligent and territorial has existed in that basin for centuries, how many times has it defended itself before 1891? Frontier records before that period are sparse. Indigenous oral traditions from the broader region speak of forest giants and ridge walkers, but translation and cultural interpretation complicate direct comparison. What is clear is that many tribes avoided certain valleys during specific seasons, citing respect rather than fear. Respect implies coexistence. Conflict tends to arise when one side assumes emptiness. Thomas Hale's final journal entry described the forest feeling closer. What if it wasn't the forest moving inward? What if it was simply the moment the watchers decided to close the distance? Of the 9 survivors, none attempted to profit from the story. No books. No traveling exhibitions. No paid lectures. In an era where sensational tales could earn money, they remained quiet. That silence is perhaps the most credible detail of all. Men who fabricate monsters tend to embellish. Men who encounter something real often struggle to describe it. Samuel Pike's final words, "It was older, and it knew we didn't belong," echo with a kind of reluctant acceptance, not hysteria. Older does not mean supernatural. It can simply mean established, rooted, adapted long before modern mapping lines divided land into property. Today, the basin still appears as a gap in human activity. Satellites see trees. Snow falls undisturbed each winter. Occasionally, a hiker ventures too close and reports that same wave of silence rolling outward like breath. Then they leave. And life resumes. No confirmed bodies of the missing 15 have ever surfaced. No bones carried downstream. No accidental discovery by loggers. If they died in ordinary ways, the forest erased them thoroughly. If they were removed intentionally, the thoroughness is even more telling. The last recorded attempt to permanently survey the basin occurred quietly and without announcement. It ended the same way all others have: early departure, vague explanations, reluctance to elaborate. Perhaps the greatest illusion humans ever believed about wilderness was that emptiness equals ownership. The valley in 1891 was not empty. It was occupied. Not by something seeking expansion. Not by something craving war. But by something that understood territory in a way the trappers did not. And so the winter of 1891 stands as a quiet correction. 24 men entered. 9 returned. 15 were absorbed into a silence that has never fully released them. If you look at a map today and trace the northern forests, you will see thousands of square miles marked with trails, camps, ranger stations, logging scars, and research outposts. And then there is the basin. Still largely untouched. Still unclaimed. Still quiet. Some mysteries demand answers. Others function as boundaries. The story of Thomas Hale and his men has endured not because of proof, but because of pattern. Silence in waves. Footprints too large. Bodies positioned deliberately. Stone markers. Low-frequency resonance. And the overwhelming sense of being evaluated rather than attacked. If the watchers still stand beyond that ridgeline, they have had more than a century to perfect invisibility. They do not need to be seen. They only need to be remembered. And as long as the story is told, not loudly, not sensationally, but carefully, perhaps that is enough. Because sometimes survival does not belong to the stronger species. It belongs to the one that understands when to remain unseen. And somewhere in a northern basin where the forest occasionally forgets to breathe, the watchers may still be there. Not hunting. Not roaming. Just standing at the boundary.